Started. Thank you all for joining tonight. Chodesh Tov to everybody. Chodesh Shvat. One more month is gone by to the shall we say the edges of the pandemic. With Hashem's help, we'll get through this month, and hopefully we will see on a fairly steady basis. We'll see our ability to overcome this machla with Hashem's help. And of course, the Egyptians had 10 plagues. We've got one, but it's a very big one. So, and it's worldwide. But Bezrat Hashem, we'll overcome. All right. Tonight we're going to talk a bit about reward and punishment, particularly punishment. And I'm going to start by asking the question, what constitutes a human act? Now, only a human act is an act for which we can be punished, or anything is punished. We don't punish dogs. We may have to somehow train them to do what is right. It's not what we would call a punishment because they really didn't do anything wrong, but they have to learn what we consider to be right. But the idea of that which is right, that which is good, or better yet, that which we ought to do, that is reserved only to human beings. I'm going to first quote for you from the Maharal Prague. The Maharal wrote so many works, very, very prolific writer. He wrote on education, he wrote philosophy, certainly he wrote on Torah, he wrote on Pirkei Avot, he wrote on so many things. He was a very, very gifted person. Yes, the legend of the golem is also attributed to him. And again, I wasn't there, so I don't know. But to me, his greatness is less than he created or did not create a golem, but that he inspired and enlightened Jews for generations with his writings. I'd like to read for you one piece from his writing. I can't hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, it's hard. No? Up? Yeah, good. All right. Most people, I think, can hear me. I hope so. And Larry, you can hear me? Good. All right, everybody. I'm sorry for the interruption. All right. He wrote prolific writings, and one of the volumes that he wrote is called Tiferet Yisrael. In short, it means the glory, the majesty of what it means to be a Jew. But here, he talks about what it means to be a human being, the majesty of being a human being. I'm going to quote for you. He writes that the difference between humans and all other creations below and above, meaning to say the angelic creations, and the animals that live here. In other words, we are sort of in a middle sphere, certainly above the animals. We are not just a sophisticated zebra, but we are a separate creation of a Kodesh Baruch Hu, and we are certainly not angels per se. That point is reinforced over and over again. So he says, but we are different from them in the following ways. That the upper beings, namely the angels, shlemutam befoal, the einam tzrichim lahotzi shlemutam elapoal. They are created complete. They're created complete. There is no, shall we say, substantive change in an angel. An angel, a malach, is a malach. Vatachtonim, and the lower species and creations, Zulat Adam, aside from man, Ein Lohem Gam Ken Yitzia El Hapoel. We do not have the idea of an ought. We grow, of course, babies grow. We have baby puppies and they grow into dogs, but that's not what we're referring to. We're referring to the capacity to consciously change, not because of any sense of fear of punishment, or not wanting to repeat a negative situation, but the genuine attempt to change. Human beings are the only ones who are capable of change. Okay, and then he says, "Yitzia el hapoel ki ma shenivru alav ein ishtanut." There is no substantive change between them. Ach Adam, he says, but humanity, human beings, men, women, hu b'choach v'yotzei el hapoel. Man is born into potential, and then that potential can become realized. Chazal use this term a lot. Me'akoach el hapoel, from pure potential to actual. That we see with the Akedah. One of the questions about the Akedah is, why does God need to test Avraham? Because God knows what Avraham will do. The answer the Ramban gives is that it does. Of course, you know what the Ramban would do, but he asked what Avraham would do. But Hashem wanted to give Avraham Avinu the opportunity to move from a potential position, spiritual position, to an actually elevated spiritual position. That's solely up to Avraham. That is solely up to Avraham. Hakol bidei shamayim. Everything comes from heaven. Chutz miyirat shamayim. Aside from what we respond to heaven. In other words, each of us is born without the capacity to choose. We're born into a certain economic strata. We're born into a certain household. We're born into a certain environment in which we find ourselves. And what differentiates us and what allows us to receive reward or, God forbid, punishment is the fact that our response to that. Poverty is found all over the world. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik was impoverished. Rabbeinu Avraham Ibn Ezra was impoverished. They didn't go out and kill people. They didn't go out and shoot people. They didn't go out and hijack cars. What they did was they used the very poverty which they had to become greater spiritual beings. And that's not limited to Jews. Non-Jews can do that as well, of course. But again, we find in our generation, I believe, a tremendous amount of excuse making for simple, violent misbehavior on any side. It doesn't matter who. And if it's a Jew that does it, it's the same thing. We have the capacity for change. Now, what makes something a human act for which we can be held accountable? Of course, this has to do with our Parsha, because after I describe these three elements to the human act for which we are held accountable, we're going to see how this affects the Parsha. For an act to be a human act, it has to have three elements. You can make a Hebrew acronym out of them. Davar, Dalet, Bet, Resh. That's an easier way to remember it. Dalet is for da'at, knowledge. I have to know when I'm performing the act that it is an act which is a desirable act, a good act, or a bad act, and either act upon it or refrain from it. That is stage one. Stage two is Bechira. Everybody, as the Rambam says, it is a foundational principle in Judaism that everybody has free will. Now, admittedly, there are people whose free will is mitigated if they're born with certain deficiencies, whether it's chemical deficiencies. We're not talking about the ability to learn math or science or even Torah. We're talking about to discern right from wrong. Certain people do not have that capacity, but those are rare. The great majority of us have that capacity to make good choices for ourselves and for other human beings. So that's first. The second one is Bechira. If I'm going to do an act, I must know that it is either good or bad, and I need to have two choices, two options. If I have only one option, then the humanness of my act, or the accountability, or what is called culpability for the act, is greatly reduced. I have to be able to choose the right path or, God forbid, the wrong path. That's very important. And the third element is ratzon. I have to desire the consequence of that act, not just the act itself, but I have to be able to desire the consequence of the act. So if someone is playing with, God forbid, they're playing with a gun, the gun goes off and shoots and maims or kills someone. So I am responsible because I knew that it certainly could hurt someone, but I didn't have the intention to do that consequence. So I don't get off scot-free, but I also am not subject to the supreme penalty that a society can give. Those are the three elements: davar, dat, knowledge; bet, bechira, options, choosing one of the two; and finally, ratzon. We have the will to will the consequence of the act. That constitutes, which is human, and therefore it is an act for which we can either be rewarded or punished. To the degree that any one of those three elements is missing, that's the degree that my culpability, either my reward or punishment, will be reduced. Okay. Now we have Paro. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe, long before Moshe goes to Mitzrayim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him that he's going to, quote, Achazek et leiv Paro. I am going to ani akshe et leiv Paro. I will, quote, harden his heart. The word kashe means to harden. We find several terms that are used somewhat interchangeably. One is ani akshe et leiv Paro, and then you have vayachazak leiv Paro, which is numerous times. But not that someone did it. It's not a transitive sentence that an actor did it to the heart, where it says, Vayachazak leiv Paro. It just says his heart was strengthened. His heart was strengthened. Not God did it necessarily. We find instances where that terminology is used through the first 5 plagues. And then we also find Vayichbad leiv Paro. Paro's heart was made heavy. Heavy as in it takes a great deal of exertion to be able to work against what one wants. Now, the word leiv in general in the Torah has to do with within itself desire, ratzon, all right? So it becomes leiv, simu leiv, place your attention at something. But if it's vayichbad leiv Paro, Paro's heart was made heavy. So heavy means that it's a metaphor for telling us that it is going to be very difficult for him to do the right thing. So the question is that we see in the 5th plague of the 7 that are mentioned in this parsha, it says, finally, vayachazek Hashem et leiv Paro. It is, I'm going to use the term transitive sentence, that Hashem himself strengthened, so to speak, doesn't necessarily mean hardened here, but strengthened Paro's heart. And we find that throughout to the end of the 10th plague as well, where the 10th plague says, Vayachazek Hashem et leiv Paro, once again, God strengthened it. Shilach et bnei Yisrael meretz. So we have a number of questions. The first question is purely a literary question. Is there a Vayachazak leiv Paro? Paro's heart was strong, or Vayachazek Hashem et leiv Paro? The answer seems pretty much obvious, that and you see that there is a consistency of before the 5th plague and after the 5th plague, in that God is not mentioned necessarily in conjunction with the resistance of Paro's heart, but then from the 6th plague and on, we have the terminology Vayachazek Hashem, a transitive term. Transitive means that you have a transitive sentence which has an actor. Every sentence has an actor. In this case, it's Hashem. Then you have a verb, God is doing something. And if it's a transitive sentence, there's a direct object, to some object. Okay, the actor is acting upon an object. In this case, the actor is Hashem from the sixth plague on, is acting upon the object, is acting upon, in this case, the heart, or we could say the will. Remember, the word lay, remember, there are three stages or three elements to the human act. So question number one is why the change? Question number two is how in any way can Paro, anybody, be held accountable if, at least from the sixth plague and on, he seems to have lost any chance to revise his behavior, to do tshuva, to change? It's a famous question. As a matter of fact, the Ramban phrases it, and he says that Im Hashem hiksha et libo, if Hashem, so to speak, hardened Paro's heart, ma pisho. Where's the sin? I only am held accountable if I consciously do a sin, if I know that it's wrong, if I have more than one choice, and if I desire the consequence. Certainly, according to at least the terminology that we're using here, Paro is missing bechira, he's missing the choice. He doesn't have a choice. That's the way it appears from here. Now, there are several ways that we can look at the response to this question. I first want to read to you what the Yalkut Shimoni says about it. He actually goes to the very last to the very last part of this week's Sedra, when the seventh plague comes, and the pasuk says, "Vayar Paro ki aita harvacha." So that Paro saw that there's a distinction between what happened to the Jews and what happened to him. So he saw, wait a minute. He said, and then he decides he's going to change. Okay, and so what does he do? What does the Yalkut Shimoni say? Kach harashaim. This is the great indicator of every Rasha. Kisheroim she'atzara ba'a lehen. Once they see that negative consequences or tsaras come upon them, hey, machni'in atzmam, they step back. They don't push back as much. Are there people who still persist even though they're wrong? Yes, but here we're talking about Paro, and he knows he's up against an invincible enemy. He's not going to defeat the Rabbani Shalom Kavayoch. But kishahatzara holechet v'ro'in et harvacha, when the plague is taken away. In each case, the plague is taken away, and that's yesh harvacha. Now he had a little bit. He saw the distinction between the Jews and him, and he saw that I'm in trouble. But then when he sees yesh harvacha, when he sees that he's got a little bit of breathing room now, the plague has been removed. So therefore, he says, chozrin l'maaseh hamara'im. As soon as he sees that the barad is taken away, he then says, okay, I got some breathing room. And then he doesn't remember what caused it, or he chooses not to remember. Selective memory is one of the cardinal aspects of a Rasha. And then the Yalkut Shimoni, in the very last comments on this week's Parsha of the Yalkut, Umot ha'olam mosifin v'chotin avo Yisrael, the non-Jewish, the nations of the world, they continue. Maybe things are terrible, so they do some sort of tshuva, but then they go right back to where they were once relief comes. Avo Yisrael, tam avonech bat Zion. When your troubles go, your sin ultimately will also be gone. Lo yosif lahaglotcha, lahaglotech. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will not continue to bring you into galut. So that's the sign. So that's one answer. That is one answer. The question about why Paro is punished is because he's not going to change. There is no permanence to his change. And since there's no permanence to his change, therefore, Hashem can use the term vayechazek. Now, I'd like to give you an example. I often say to my classes, I certainly can say it here. If someone would say to you, listen, I'll give you $50 if you kill somebody. Now, most people smile when they hear that. Mostly, in almost every class, they sort of smile. What are you, ridiculous? Then I up the ante to 100, to 1,000, to 2,000. The answer is still no. And I believe very much that due to many circumstances, people who live in a Jewish culture, a Torah culture, $5,000 can't get them to kill somebody. 10,000. It's absurd. But there are certain neighborhoods, wherever in any city in which we live, for a pair of gym shoes, somebody can be killed. Ba'avur na'alayim, as the Navi said, right? They're perfectly quite capable to kill somebody just for shoes, or a jacket, or cigarettes, right? That doesn't, now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that people are inherently bad. It means, though, that culture has a tremendous amount to do with what is tempting to us. So when it comes to Paro, and what the Yalkut is telling us, God doesn't have to in any mechanical way change Paro's resistance. All he has to do is take away the plague. That's all that's necessary. Take away the plague. And Paro then says, you know what? Not so bad. I weathered that. I can weather the other things as well. That is the sign of a Russia. Whereas with people know who they are. Once they realize that they had bad times and they're coming now upon good times. So hopefully, as a matter of fact, Rav Hirsch mentions this as well, as do others, that the difference between great people and mediocrity is a great person, or let's put it this way, a person of mediocre spirituality, person who is a non-thinking person. So no matter what happens to them, they're not permanently changed. They rise and then they sink back pretty much to where they were. But good people, not even tzaddikim, good people, not to mention tzaddikim, they are never permanently, no matter how difficult the problem, they are never permanently separated from knowing what is good. So people who are mediocre in their lives, in their spiritual lives, nothing seems to make a substantive, permanent change. And so it is with Rishonim, particularly. They revert back to what they were. Now, still the question, even though that's an answer, that God did not make Paro do things that were wrong. He did not take away the second element of humanness, the human act. All he did was give him the opportunity, just by removing the plague, to make a choice now, either to become better or not. Other people say that the issue is for how did Paro strengthen. Notice again the word lechazek is an important word. That doesn't mean harden. That means to strengthen. Give him the courage and the motivation to continue one way or the other, and that becomes the hallmark of Vayachazek Hashem at Lev Paro. Second. All right. So now the Gemara talks to us about. The Gemara says as follows: that there's a principle in Jewish life in general, principle in the Torah, that is haba l'taher potchin lo. Haba l'tameh, a person who seeks to in some way contaminate their soul. Haba l'tameh, someone seeks to contaminate their soul. So the Gemara says potchin lo. The door is open. The door is open. Haba l'taher, someone who comes to purify themselves spiritually, Nisayan lo. God helps them. The door for Paro was always open. We'll talk about it in a moment, but the door for Paro was always open. He had the opportunity to change, but it didn't take much for him to revert back to what he was. So he did have that option. Now, there is a view attributed to the Rambam that you didn't see God, you don't see Vayachazek Hashem et Lev Paro, God actually actively, so to speak, taking away Paro's free will, the sixth plague. The first 5 plagues was his opportunity to do tshuva. And then there comes a time where he becomes an example for everybody else. That's yet another view as to why Hashem, what does it mean by Chazek Hashem et Lev Paro, that Hashem strengthened him? It means, say, he had his chance, first 5 plagues. I think it's sort of like a person who, if you're on the 10th floor of a building, and you're contemplating, God forbid, putting an end to things. So you can walk to the door. You can walk to the window, and you still can change your mind. You can open the window and still change your mind. You can actually sit on the ledge and still change your mind. But there comes a point of no return. The point of no return for him, for the person who's going to commit suicide, Nebuch, is once he jumps. Once he jumps, there's no return. And Paro had options, many opportunities, but he saw in himself, and this is one of the important lessons I think you find 3 times in this week's Parsha, that Hashem tells Paro why he's bringing the makot, and never does it mention to get the Jews out of slavery. That he should know that I'm in the midst of the world, I'm God in control of the world, but it doesn't say to take the Jews out. That seems to be the reason that of the answer is Paro had so corrupted his own thinking that he actually thought himself to be a god. And when a person thinks that he's a god, slavery, enslaving other people, causing them so much pain, so much indignity, an entire nation. So that's a symptom. The disease is a perversion of the natural order. There is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is a creator, then there are, as the Maharal says, then there are the upper bodies, there's human beings. And when you believe that you are a God, you've perverted that natural order. Once you do that, you can do anything. Once you have an Aryan race, then slavery and genocide is the natural consequence of that perverted theory. Now, I just want to close with 2 pieces. One is from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Such a brilliant, wonderful writer. Again, I try to let people know when I think certain works are wonderful. Just about anything that Rabbi Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, wrote is of value for us. But this one, he has a series on all the books of the Torah called Covenant and Conversation. Covenant and Conversation. And that, of course, covenant is a fundamental theme for him, as it is for Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. And the other thing is that in conversation, he was the great communicator of our age. Here's what he writes. Evil has 2 faces. The first, turn to the outside world, is what it does to its victim. So if you look at what the Nazis did to the Jews, if you look what Paro did to the Jews, if you look at what apartheid did to the South African Black community, so that's what you can say, oh, I see what they did to him. But the second, he said, the second evil turned within is what it does to the perpetrator. The perpetrator no longer can see the reality of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be at Tzelem Elokim and to interact with Tzelem Elokim, to be in the image of God and to interact with others who are themselves in the image of God. And then he says, remember we talked about the idea of will. You have ratzon, the will to do something, the will of the consequence. And of course, you have to have the same will to change. Tshuva is a matter of will. So notice what he says. Unless the will constantly exercised, it atrophies and dies. When we become objects, not subjects, swept along by the tides of action, or the caprice of desire, or the passion that becomes an obsession, then we become slaves to our will. We are, and if we don't, then of course we become slaves. That's why Chazal tell us that kol hakohes, for example, someone who is always given to anger, Ki'ilu avad avodah zarah. It's as if he is involved in pagan worship. Why? Because he's supposed to control himself, but yet he's supposed to, not only he's supposed to control his will, but he's also supposed to be subservient to God. But when a person cannot control his emotions on a regular basis, they atrophy. Then what happens is he becomes a servant to them and not to God. Therefore, it's like he's serving avodah zarah. I want to conclude with actually one beautiful poem called Invictus. Invictus means unconquerable. It was written in the late 19th century by William Ernest Henley. And it has 4 lines, which at the end, it's a longer poem, but it has 4 lines at the end, which I think sum up what we have tonight. It matters not how straight the gate, meaning say prison, being in prison. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am captain of my soul. When we live a life of integrity, we are the captains of our soul. We can still do tshuva. But when our life is based upon the next pleasure or the next sensual desire, whatever it may be, then it is in control of us. We're not then the captain of our souls. And when we cease to become the captains of our souls, we become very much like Edward Hyde in Jekyll and Hyde. Dr. Jekyll had a potion that he kept taking. He wanted to see what it's like to be an evil person. And he kept taking it and taking it and taking it until such time where he was no longer be able to revert back to be the good person that he was, Jekyll. That's with us. What an Vaeira does is Vaeira goreret Vaeira. An Vaeira leads to the next Vaeira. But the beauty of life is mitzvah goreret mitzvah. As there is in physics, so there is in life itself. That an object in motion continues in motion in a constant path, unless it is interrupted by another force. When we set ourselves in motion to do good, to do chesed, to avoid hurting other people, we continue in that motion. Those people who sadly live a life of subjugation of other people, sadly, it's much, much harder for them to change. Well, I want to wish everybody again Chodesh Tov, and Nir Hashem will pick it up next week, Parshat Bo. Good evening, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Rabbi.
Good to see everyone.
Nice to see you.